Chapter 6, No Surrender Crew. Boxer Musketeer had seemed happy enough when Wiener Kellerstein was above him in the biker hierarchy, in the Annihilators, Loners, and the early months of the Canadian Banditos. In time, however, Boxer also grew to enjoy holding the title of Banditos National Presidente for himself. Members generally preferred him too, despite his increasingly volatile temper made worse by snorts of cocaine and his almost total inability to manage money. He could be a gentle, even sweet, appreciative man, or violent and unforgiving, but he was always trustworthy and genuinely tried to embody the old school 1%er ideals of bikes and brotherhood. With Boxer, everything was from the heart, and he often punctuated his sentences with the phrase top left, which was his way of saying from the heart without sounding too mushy. Members found him easier to read than Wiener Kellerstein, with his mercurial mood swings and stream of conscious ratings in which he somehow equated the Confederacy, the American Revolution, and Nazism with goodness in Canada. Boxer Musketeer could barely read and write and didn't bother playing historian, but he was straightforward, honest, fearless, and loyal to a fault, which was just fine with them. Despite Wiener's strange and violent ways, Boxer wasn't about to abandon the man who had brought him into the outlaw biker fold. During Kellerstein's frequent stays behind bars, Boxer would pass a hat for donations to help pay the mortgage and utilities at Wiener's farm. Others in the club grumbled that they weren't entitled to such largesse when they were in custody, but they didn't dare challenge Boxer on it, more out of respect for his hard knuckles than for Wiener's financial well-being. For his part, no one gave more to Kellerstein than Boxer, so he didn't see why his other brothers shouldn't help out too. As Boxer assumed the Banditos' top Canadian post, he found he was also defending his old friend to other members. There was the embarrassment about the time that Wiener crashed a gay pride march on Richmond Street in downtown London, flanked by white supremacists with shaved heads and black t-shirts with the clenched fist logo on their backs. It was a public display by the Bikers Against Pedophiles group founded by Concrete Dave Weech, the biker son of local Nazi Martin Weech. In a symbolic message that only he could understand, Kellerstein waved a Confederate flag in front of the news cameras and made a great show of moral rectitude. Toronto area clubmates shuddered at the unseemly media freak show of Kellerstein attempting to mock gays. There is an understanding that a 1%er club shouldn't get involved in any political cause unless it was something that directly affects them, like motorcycle helmet laws. The idea is that they are supposed to be freedom-loving rebels, not bigots who try to impose their values on others. The Greater Toronto Area Banditos worried that things like the Pride Parade debacle only destroyed whatever mystique they may have built up and would have inevitably made them targets of jokes themselves. It makes you look like small-town hillbillies, one former Toronto Area Bandito grumbled. If you keep your mouth shut, you keep some mystique. Boxer also veered away from gay bashing, just as he made it clear that he wasn't a racist or an anti-Semite. For someone who looked like a good old boy, he could be surprisingly liberal and tolerant. They all have a mother, Boxer told a club friend. People are who they are. They just have to be given respect. Look at how people look at us. But not only did Kellerstein not worry about what mainstream society thought about him, he didn't seem to care even what his biker brothers thought either. Some club members quietly noted that Kellerstein still didn't have a working Harley on the road, a pretty clear-cut violation of the Bandito bylaws and a complete mockery of the 1%er lifestyle. And although he didn't ride a bike himself, Wiener somehow still felt entitled to call for the expulsion of others for the same infraction of club rules. Members also bristled at how Kellerstein would wind the Boxer until meetings were rescheduled at the last minute from Toronto to his ramshackle barn so that he would be spared the 2-hour drive into Toronto. When Boxer complied, Wiener wasn't sheepish. Instead, he loudly called for discipline against any members who balked at attending. He also didn't appear at all grateful to Boxer, who made his mortgage and utility payments several times. Instead, he still seemed to smolder with jealousy about Boxer's success and treated such preferential treatment as his due, not as a favor. He was Boxer's buddy, so he could pretty much get away with anything, a former member said. He thought absolutely nothing of inconveniencing other people. He'd moan like a baby if he had to do something that wasn't to his liking. It was hard to take Wiener Kellerstein totally serious, even if he signed his name with SS and clearly had a backer and boxer. When he wasn't there, others in the club would sometimes chuckle over stories of him sobbing and begging for forgiveness back in the late 1970s when he was accused of murdering Toronto clothing store owner John DiFilippo, allegedly showing up at the retailer's door posing as a pizza delivery man. No matter how many weapons he stockpiled, he only seemed to be acting nuts. "I don't think he's as crazy as he let on," Atkinson later said. He'd always had the advantage figured out. How he could do anything to his advantage. Crazy people don't think like that. Despite Kellerstein's bizarre antics, this was a time of growth and potential. Any Friday the 13th is a special day for the 1%er bikers to get together. And on Friday, September 13, 2002, some 20 members of Killer B's West Side, the Banditos' Keswick-based junior support club, arrived in mass at a stage thrown for Bam Bam Serlano at a banquet hall on Highway 27 on the Mississauga-Toronto border. The Killer B's West Side were a force on the streets of small-town Keswick, where they outnumbered the local Hells Angels by a half dozen members. That night at Bam Bam's Stag, there wasn't anything too wild going on out of respect for his fiancée, Stephanie, but it was an impressive show of brotherhood and muscle nonetheless. The Stag gave Bam Bam a chance to settle an old debt through raffle tickets sold on a 42-inch plasma television. Bam Bam whispered to some guests that he could greatly improve their chances of winning if they'd only pay him an extra $20. "Trust me, I'll make sure your number has a better chance of coming up," he told them. As he pocketed the extra 20s, word sifted out to a few guests that Bam Bam had sold the real winning ticket a couple of weeks before to cover up a debt, then fixed the raffle so that the draw would have the appearance of fairness. That evening, as the man who bought the winning ticket was outside smoking a cigarette, Bam Bam quickly called out the winning number. Bam Bam refused to allow friends of the winner to run out and get him so that he could collect his prize. Instead, Bam Bam drew yet another ticket belonging to a relative who had also been promised the win. There was something about Bam Bam that made such pretty scams seem almost endearing, as he constantly sought out angles that might somehow help him without really hurting anyone else. Salerno had more angles than the geometry class, an old friend said, chuckling at the memory of the television draw scam. The Ontario Hells Angels continued to be acutely aware of the movements of the Toronto Banditos, although the two clubs still hadn't clashed significantly. In the agenda for the Central Canada Officers Meeting in November 2002, Robert Donnie Patterson and the Regent Secretary noted a meeting between an unidentified Bandito and Paul Sasquatch Sauce Porter, who had defected to start up a chapter of the elite Hells Angels Nomads in the Ottawa area. The Angels' minutes used a mocking, condescending tone to discuss their supposed rivals. Bandits, a bandit approached Sauce Porter during a chance meeting at a gas station. The bandit wanted to talk about peace. "We didn't know we were at war. Some Toronto bandits wanted to leave and become loners again." It took a lot of optimism to imagine a day when Boxers Banditos might reach the level of the Ontario Angels. Hells Angels chapters like the ones on Ortano Avenue in Oshawa or on Eastern Avenue in downtown Toronto had computers with encrypted internet systems, reinforced steel doors, security cameras, and listening devices to alert them to unwanted visitors, as well as fully stocked bars to entertain visitors. The Eastern Avenue Clubhouse even had a metal sculpture of the club's trademarked winged skull on its property. Unlike most biker clubs, the Toronto Banditos still didn't have a clubhouse or even regular nights for church meetings. They met randomly in members' homes on Saturday afternoons, Sunday nights, and pretty much any evening, although they like to keep Fridays free for run. The profile of the Toronto Banditos rose significantly in late 2002 with the addition of Frank Cisco Lenti, who was by now in his mid-50s and a survivor of more than 4 decades of gang activity. Lenti's demeanor could be ultra polite, like a maitre who likes to serve, or he could work his face into a nightmarish intensity like Charles Manson on steroids. He preferred to be genial, which belied the fact that he had been a genuine force to be reckoned with in the greater Toronto area underworld for decades. It was Lenti who had introduced Cecil Kirby to the old Satan's Choice to powerful Cosmeo Elia Camiso for enforcement jobs back in the late 1970s and early 1980s. As he did this, Lenti warned the mobster, "Remember, he's not one of us," meaning Kirby wasn't of Italian heritage. When Kirby turned informant, claiming that his family was under threat from the mob, Lenti distanced himself from Canadian authorities by quickly relocating to the Italian city of Perugia, north of Rome, for 2 years, sometimes riding his Harley Davidson Softail with Italian Hells Angels. After his return to Canada, Lenti was on good terms for a time with the local Hells Angels. He was then in the Loners, and the Hells Angels provided intelligence that 2 Loners members were police informants. It was as if the Angels knew more about the Loners than the Loners knew about themselves. While Lenti appreciated the heads up, he didn't like how the Hells Angels also seemed compelled to micromanage Loners' business. It was tough for a man like Lenti not to bristle at the Angels' arrogance, and even more maddening that they were generally right about things. So in 1994, when some senior Hells Angels visited the Loners Clubhouse and offered Lenti membership in their worldwide organization, he had a rude surprise for them, a cordial invitation to join the Loners instead. Not surprisingly, the Hells Angels stormed out. By August 1995, Lenti was running his own club, the Diablos. He placed the initials MG for Motorcycle Gang after the club's name, rather than the standard, more politically correct MC for Motorcycle Club. While other clubs shunned the word gang, Lenti embraced it wholeheartedly, boasting, "I'll show them who the real freaking gang is." There was a buzz during the summer of 1995 that Lenti was about to fold his Diablos to set up his own Woodbridge chapter of the Satan's Choice, which would be a direct insult to the Woodbridge Loners. On the morning of Thursday, August 25th, Lenti was just settling into the driver's seat of his Ford Explorer in the driveway of his Woodbridge home when someone nearby pushed down on a detonator button. The explosion that followed blew off a chunk of Lenti's buttock and leg, crushed his pelvis, and covered him with burns. It was something of a miracle that he lived to wake up in a hospital to hear a doctor say that he would never walk again. Lenti proved the prediction wrong, although riding a motorcycle would be extremely painful. Police and bikers alike strongly suspected that the pipe bomb had been planted by a Woodbridge loner who would later become a Hells Angel, but no one was ever prosecuted for the crime. The only charges from the attack were against Lenti himself, as police found a loaded submachine gun and a 9mm semi-automatic handgun in the wreckage of the Explorer. After regaining consciousness, Lenti tried to reassure York Regional Police Detective Angelo Di Lorenzi that the weapons were no threat to public safety. "I was using them for my kind of people," Lenti told the detective. "I wasn't using them for law-abiding citizens." The pipe bombing wasn't enough to kill Frank Lenti, but it did slow him down a little. When the weather turned cold or damp, he complained of pain in his joints, although he could still take his Harley Davidson Road King out for spins. There had been a rumor that the explosion had torn off his testicles, but Lenti proved that to be a lie. Almost a decade after the blast, the limping grandfather fathered another son. There were also stories that he had a heavy-duty metal cane, which could serve as a club, and another with a sword hidden inside. The tales about the canes were considered more reliable than the myth that he had lost his balls. Lenti's mystique grew as he survived the bomb blast, and his membership in the Banditos offered the promise of steering the club to glory days in the not-so-distant future. Ripper Fullager affectionately called him Old Frank, even though he was, in reality, a few years older than Lenti. Ripper clearly enjoyed having Lenti around, although he grimaced when Lenti insisted on calling the club a gang. The semantic disagreement wasn't enough to seriously strain their friendship, but it always got a rise out of Ripper nonetheless. In addition to a tough, seasoned new member, Bosker's Bandito chapter also had a grand nickname, the No Surrender Crew. The name was the idea of Ronway Atkinson, who had lived for a couple of years in Belfast and proudly announced his heritage with a Celtic braid tattoo on his left arm. Atkinson noted that a branch of the Irish Republican Army was nicknamed the No Surrender Crew, and if it was good enough for them, it also worked for Boxer Musketeer's homeless bunch. Low-key and literate, Atkinson was a strong diplomat as Lenti was a survivor. He found parallels between Irish politics and those of the outlaw biker world, and appreciated the old joke that the first order of business for a new Irish political organization is how to deal with the inevitable split. He had lived in Ireland shortly after leaving high school and toured Britain as a rock drummer, a youthful fantasy job, but not a great way of making a living. He returned to Ireland in 1999 with Wayne J. Connor of the Loners to meet with members of the Irish Alliance. The Alliance was a confederation of independent motorcycle clubs that were loosely pulled together by a desire to keep international clubs like the Hells Angels off their turf, in much the same way that small independent clubs had managed for years to present a united front and block the Hells Angels from moving into Toronto. In the late 1900s, the Loners also had Irish connections through Pluto, a member and tattoo artist who lived in Dublin, and another member named Ivan who had also lived there. Back before the patch over to the Banditos, Loners president Jimmy Rosso had sent Atkinson and Connor to Ireland in an effort to reach out to the Devil's Disciples in hopes of expansion. The Loners had socialized with the Devil's Disciples for a couple of nights in Belfast and Dublin, where they stayed in the clubhouse and a gutted city bus that served as a mobile party place. There was also partying north of Dublin in the seaside town of Skerries, where the Irish bikers had their own scaled-down version of the Sturgis Bike Rally. When the visit was over, however, the Devil's Disciples remained independent, and the Canadians had dramatically underestimated how strongly the Irish bikers opposed an invasion by the international clubs, whom they seemed to regard as nothing more than modern-day Huns. It was during that trip that Ronway Atkinson was given his nickname after getting lost and ending up in the wrong town. Boxers Banditos also entertained grand thoughts of international expansion, and Atkinson was back in Ireland in 2003 with the British bandito known as Mick the Nomad in an unsuccessful attempt to persuade the Irish Alliance to become Banditos. By this time, Atkinson had risen to become El Secretario of the Banditos in Canada. Despite his high rank in the club, there were times when others in the No Surrender crew found him decidedly unbikerish, such as when he sat immersed in literary works like James Joyce's The Dubliners, while other Banditos partied. No explanation was needed for a chapter member to dig his nose into a line of cocaine, but burying it in a book was quite another matter. "What the fuck are you doing?" a bandito named Beaver had asked. For Atkinson's part, the works of Joyce seemed to fit in with his biker life. He, James Joyce, was an outsider in his own community, Atkinson later said. "I felt like that myself." In June 2003, the No Surrender crew seemed primed to take on another high-profile member, Joey Crazy Horse Morin from Edmonton. Morin had been in email contact with this club since October 2001 when he sent a message signed only John Doe XXX. In it, he wrote hopefully, "I believe now is a very good time. I am a very educated and influential individual who's quite familiar with biker politics. There are more of us whom are very interested in claiming territory with you, but for now, I am doing the initiating. We have to start somewhere. In time, he and Ronway Atkinson developed a friendly friendship. Like Boxer Musketeer, Morin had also been a pugilist, but unlike Boxer, he shunned cocaine use. Still in his early 30s, Joey Crazy Horse was relatively young, intense, strong, and tough, and he didn't suffer fools well. He also didn't brag about how, in 1991, he had been awarded a Medal of Bravery from the Governor General for helping pull a man and two boys from a flame-filled truck. He showed fearlessness of a different sort when he printed up stickers to mock a group of former rebels clubmates who had gone over to the Hells Angels. The ink was in the old rebels' colors of red and black and read, "Support me, myself, and I," a bold public statement that he considered his old clubmates to be sellouts. Joey Crazy Horse arrived in Toronto in early 2003 with a few rebels from Alberta for a meeting with the No Surrender crew. He clearly had some unexplained problem with the Hells Angels that was pushing him towards the Banditos' fold, but the visitors weren't taking any possible move towards the Banditos lightly, as they had plenty to lose. And it was clear that the days of the strong, small, independent clubs seemed to be numbered. Up to that point, Western Canada was considered red and white, or Hells Angels territory, and clearly the Angels wouldn't welcome an attempt by their rivals to plant a flag there. The rebels also had jobs, bank accounts, credit cards, and motorcycles, all things in painfully short supply among the No Surrender crew. As they met, it seemed that each of the rebels was wearing $50,000 or so worth of jewelry, while most of the Torontoians couldn't afford Harleys and some lived with their parents. If the Albertans signed on, then Boxers Club would gain a few $1,000s a month in dues, as well as immeasurable prestige. What the rebels stood to gain was far harder to measure. That weekend, there was a party at Celestine's farm, and the Torontoians could only shudder at the impression made by the garrulous hillbilly. Worse yet, Boxer lost his temper with a Toronto club member over something trivial. He worked himself into a fury and took a swing at the guy in plain view of the Albertans. Chopper Repulso was floating around the farm stone, which was also bad form. As he left for home, an Alberta rebel confided to someone he trusted that he wasn't crazy about the idea of paying dues to drug addicts. In Joey Crazy Horse, Boxer saw nothing less than a chance for a great western expansion. The party at the Celestine farm certainly wasn't a success, but it didn't kill Boxer's dream either. He flew out to the prairies that spring to continue to woo Joey Crazy Horse's group, but when he returned home, his mood was somewhere between angry and depressed. Boxer hated flying at the best of times, and he especially hated flights with the stopover, as he reasoned this doubled his chances of dying in a crash during takeoff or landing. More unsettling was what Boxer saw when he landed in Alberta. The Westerners were even better organized than he had expected, even though they didn't belong to an international or even a national club. Why they might want to join his Banditos was a mystery. That spring, the No Surrender crew deemed Big Paul Sinapoli and Cameron Acorn, whom Foulager called the Fat One and the Skinny One, worthy of the prospect patches. Boxer seemed particularly impressed by Acorn. Maybe it was his energy and natural leadership ability, or maybe it was that Acorn still listened to his mother, who called herself Mama B. Whatever the case, Boxer trusted him enough to put him on a fast track to full patch status. And the Victoria Day weekend in May traditionally marks the commencement of riding season for Canadian bikers. When the big weekend rolled around in 2003, the weather was perfect for striking out as a pack on their Harleys. But only Lengthy, Boxer, Wrongway, Atkinson, and Crash Caracas actually had working motorcycles. Lengthy was livid. He had a good excuse for not riding since he had been blown almost in half by a bomb. Yet, he was still gamely riding his bike. A few days later, only about 10 of 18 club members showed up to the barbecue in Ripper's backyard. If they weren't about motorcycles or big on brotherhood, it was natural to wonder what exactly was the point of the Toronto Banditos chapter. Certainly none of them was making money as big-time criminals. Although the club lacked money, members, and motorcycles, Boxer still often mustered up a swagger on the streets and was especially cocky in internet chat rooms. He loved to goad and mock the Hells Angels, calling them losers and making veiled threats. Perhaps that was on the mind of Woodbridge Hells Angels in mid-June 2003 when they heard that Caracas of the No Surrender crew had been spotted sitting alone in a Woodbridge restaurant wearing Banditos gear. The two sides had reached an agreement of sorts in Woodbridge, whereby the Banditos could wear their colors on the west side of Highway 400, which bisected the town, while the Angels could openly wear their colors on the east side. That afternoon, Crash was dining alone on the wrong side of town. For the most part, the Greater Toronto Area Hells Angels ignored the Banditos or treated them with contempt. But Crash's appearance at the restaurant on their side of town was too provocative to ignore. In their eyes, it was nothing less than a public insult. A half-dozen Hells Angels quickly arrived, including a particularly beefy specimen known as Mr. Meanie. Crash was no match for Mr. Meanie, even if he had wanted a fight. He had been an enthusiastic high school rugby player, but he was too bound by ideas like fair play and kindness to be an effective, down and dirty brawler. So when the Hells Angels interrupted Crash's solitary meal to tell him they wanted to speak with him immediately in the parking lot, he panicked and refused, calling a friend for help. That friend instantly telephoned Frank Lengthy, who lived just a few minutes away. Although he was almost 60 and walking with a pronounced limp, Lenti didn't ask how many Hells Angels were at the restaurant or wait for backup when he got the call. He simply hopped in his tow truck and roared over to help his biker brother. When he got there, the Angels were gone and the police were just arriving. Crash was still in the restaurant with a fresh black eye that bore the imprint of a large ring worn by one of the Angels. Lenti was beside himself with anger. Outlaw bikers aren't supposed to call the police, no matter what the threat. They are supposed to take care of business themselves. It had been nervous restaurant staff who called the police, but it still looked bad, as if Crash was somehow a rat. If Crash had gone outside to settle things up with the Angels, he might have taken a beating, but a few bruises were immeasurably preferable to this public embarrassment. An emergency meeting was called that night at Ripper Fuller's, followed by a sit-down with Eastern Avenue Hells Angels. In the end, most of Boxer and Lenti's anger was directed at Crash. The Angels had done exactly what you'd expect a 1%er club to do. They had marked their turf and protected their brand. Crash's behavior wasn't so favorable. "You should have fought like a man," Boxer told him more than once. Not long after his beating, Crash moved from Woodbridge down into Toronto into a luxury condominium with proper security. He told a few close friends of the move, but not a word was said to Frank Lenti or Boxer Muscadere. They may have been his brothers, but they were now brothers he didn't want dropping by. Joe Crazy Horse was back in Toronto that June, at the time of Crash's restaurant debacle. The more he saw of Boxer's no surrender crew, the more doubts he nursed about it. During that visit, he attended a get-together at the Club Pro Adult Entertainment Lounge in Vaughan, where Lenti worked in a loosely defined security capacity. While the strippers were plentiful and accommodating, Joe Crazy Horse remained uneasy about linking his fate with that of the Torontoians. There was something exciting about the potential here, but they needed to build on Lenti's muscle, Atkinson's brains, and Boxer's fearless loyalty. Otherwise, they could expect more beatings or worse.